So my name's Eric Lidji. I'm the director of the Rauh Jewish Archives at the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh. I'm so pleased at the turnout that we have today. And I'm so pleased that there's so many people from Atlanta because it means that I can tell all my old stories and nobody will have heard them yet. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background about the Jewish Archives. Can everybody see my screen now? Can you see it, Jeremy? Okay.
Yep.
Good. So the Jewish Archives in Pittsburgh traces back to a historical society that was founded in about 1970. And if we had a longer talk, I would explain kind of the interesting story of that. But for our purposes, they really did not do much collecting until 1987. And at that point, the community decided that it wanted to have a centralized repository for Jewish records. And so they started this survey where they went out to every single Jewish organization in the region, more than 100 organizations all over Western Pennsylvania, and just found what people had. And at the end of that year, they discovered that there was more than enough stuff to justify the creation of a Jewish archive. And so in November of 1988, what was then called the Jewish Archives of Western Pennsylvania was founded. The name of it was changed in 1999 after the Rauh family, when Richard Rauh endowed the archive. And today we have about 1,000 collections that document all aspects of Jewish life throughout Western Pennsylvania. And in a weird way, Western Pennsylvania is sort of like the South in that there's a regional nature to the Jewish community. So in the way that Southern Jewish life is often seen as a group unit, Western Pennsylvania has a lot of interesting regional aspects to it. So we've always been a regional archive. About 10 years ago, we started expanding into digital content that has become really important for us over the past few months. So we were one of the first Jewish communities in the country to digitize its Jewish newspapers. That was through the Pittsburgh Jewish Newspaper Project. So that has newspapers from 1895 to about 2010. And then a few years later, we created a website called A Tradition of Giving, which was an overview of all the Jewish philanthropic efforts in Pittsburgh, going back to the first cemetery that was created in 1847, all the way to the 100th anniversary of our federation in 2012. A few years after that, we created a website called Generation to Generation. And this was an attempt to profile our family collections. So we've got probably about 200 family collections in the archives. These give you such a rich sense of what Jewish life is like at different points in history. And then over the years, we've expanded this website to include profiles of small town Jewish communities. And we also have a cemetery database on here that has about 70,000 burial records that keeps people from having to tromp out into the cemeteries, or if they want to go out into the cemeteries, they can find what they're looking for. We have about 80 Jewish cemeteries in Western Pennsylvania, so it can be a little difficult to find what you're looking for. And then last year, we launched our first podcast. It's called The Cornerstone. And my partner on this project, Abigail Oren, I think is on the call today. And what we did with this project was it was an attempt to connect places in Western Pennsylvania with archival material. So one of the things that's really special about Pittsburgh, if you've been up here, is that the built environment, all the buildings, have largely stayed stable in most of the city. And what that means is that you can look at a building and then you can go into the archive and see an old picture of that building, and you can make these really beautiful connections between past and present. So the first season of that launched last year, and we're working on the second season right now. And then of course, we've been doing a lot of real-time collecting. So as I'm sure all of you know, Pittsburgh was the site of a large anti-Semitic shooting in October 2018. And since then, the Jewish Archive has been leading the efforts to preserve materials from that attack. So what you're looking at here is the hundreds of boxes of memorial objects that have come into various organizations throughout the city. We've also been doing real-time collecting through what's called archiving the internet. So there are tools that allow you to essentially take snapshots of web pages. That's oversimplifying it a little bit, but for the sake of our conversation today, it allows you to take a snapshot of a website or a news article or a social media page and to save that in the way that we used to save physical copies of the newspaper and have those in a box in the archive. And now with COVID, we're doing the same thing. We had created an infrastructure. And so to date, I think we've archived something like 500 or 600 web pages for Jewish organizations in Pittsburgh, having to do with how they transitioned from being in a synagogue to being remote. And that includes of course, the congregations, but also our day schools and our Jewish organizations and the like. All right, so the idea for this talk preceded a lot of what's happening in the news right now. We had the idea of doing this two cities talk, and this was kind of the obvious link between Pittsburgh and Atlanta. Part of the reason why Rabbi Rothschild was on my mind is because I had gone to a talk where a local professor was looking at previous instances of anti-Semitic violence and was talking about the temple bombing and had mentioned Rabbi Rothschild. And I was sitting next to Martha Berg, who is the archivist for Rodef Shalom. And we both looked at each other because we knew that Rabbi Rothschild was from Pittsburgh. And so it was this interesting Pittsburgh connection for this event that did not take place in Pittsburgh. Martha was kind enough to share some of her research with me. And so I was able to use that as the basis for what I'm going to share with you today. Before I start, I just kind of want to frame the conversation a little bit. One of the things that's most challenging with history that I found is knowing how to correlate what happened in the past to the present. And I think for the Jewish community, we have a lot of pride that we take in the civil rights work that we did in the 50s and 60s. And sometimes it's hard to know what that looks like today. And I think when you explore people like Rabbi Rothschild who had successes during that time period, it gives you insights. There's little details in their life that when you look at them, you can say, maybe that, if I take that and apply it to today, that's the way that I can use the past to inform the present. So I'm just going to give a sense of the milieu of Rabbi Rothschild's life and in a few ways that I think connects to the work that he became famous for in Atlanta. So I want to start with Squirrel Hill. So Squirrel Hill is the neighborhood where Rabbi Rothschild grew up. It is an iconic Jewish neighborhood in Pittsburgh. Today, it is the last urban Jewish community outside of New York. It's been the center of Jewish life in Pittsburgh for 80 years. It's had a Jewish community for 100 years. And when you read Janice's book, she quotes, I believe it's Rabbi Rothschild's mother, as saying that they were one of the first Jewish families in Squirrel Hill. And that seems to be right. If you look through the city directories, you start to see the Rothschilds pop up in Squirrel Hill around 1915. And the first Jewish religious services in the neighborhood were not until the high holidays of 1917. So they were there at least 2 and maybe more years before there was any Jewish communal life in the neighborhood. So I want to start with a quick geography lesson for the people who are not from Pittsburgh. You're looking at a map of Pittsburgh, and this is the famous 90 neighborhoods map of Pittsburgh. And what I've done is I've colored red the neighborhoods that had Jewish synagogues, so actual synagogue buildings or a building that was used for religious services. And then the gold dot is Squirrel Hill. So you're looking at 1900. And in 1900, the Jewish community was very condensed in the downtown area. And there was the beginnings of the Jewish migration into what's called the Hill District. The Hill District is the Pittsburgh equivalent of the Lower East Side. It was the site of Jewish settlement for a period of about 40 years. It had something like 24 synagogues. It had a settlement house. It had all sorts of Jewish organizations. It was a very Jewish neighborhood. And so you can see that Squirrel Hill at this point is really like a remote pastoral suburb of that city center. If we jump 10 years to 1910, you can see that the Jewish community has really started to move out of that city center. So the Hill District was becoming increasingly crowded. There were not yards in the Hill District. It was mostly row houses. There was no city park for many years in the Hill District. There were issues with crime. There was issues with pollution because it was very close to the mills along the river. And as families were able to leave the neighborhood, they did. And because of immigration, every family that left, there was sort of another family behind them coming in. But you can see that by 1910, the Jewish community has started to spread out throughout the city, but has not arrived in Squirrel Hill yet. By 1920, you start to get communities in Squirrel Hill. And so we know that the Rothschilds came between those two maps that I just showed you. So you can see they were really one of the pioneers of the neighborhood. And then just to jump to today, you can see that Squirrel Hill is condensed as basically the center of the community, sort of a greater Squirrel Hill area. The Rothschilds lived in a section of Squirrel Hill that, if there's any Pittsburghers on the call, I'll say south of Forbes, and you'll know what I'm talking about. So Squirrel Hill is a gigantic neighborhood geographically. Forbes Avenue cuts somewhat across the middle, and it divides the neighborhood economically for the most part. So there's bigger houses north of Forbes and smaller houses south of Forbes. And there's this little subdivision that's right off the main drag, Murray Avenue, And it's Eldridge Street, what then was called Sanford or Sherbrooke Street, and Pittock, and then they all kind of feed into Shady Avenue. And you can see that between 1911 and 1923, that whole subdivision was built. So they were moving into a middle-class neighborhood that had just been created. And when they get there in 1915, they were probably the first people to live in their house that they moved into. But these were not fancy big houses. So these are the two houses that they lived in. The top one is where they lived as of 1915, and it's a duplex. They lived on the top floor of that duplex. And then a few years later, they moved two streets over to Pittock Street, which is where that house at the bottom is where Rabbi Rothschild would have been born. So with the economic growth of the 1920s, that was especially beneficial for merchants, and also with the construction of roadways in Pittsburgh that made it easier to get from Squirrel Hill to downtown, Squirrel Hill really started to build in population, and it became a very Jewish neighborhood. By the time that Jacob Rothschild graduates from high school in 1927, there are essentially 3 Jewish synagogues, Jewish congregations in the neighborhood, on the way to about a dozen. And the neighborhood was within a few years of being the largest Jewish settlement in Pittsburgh. So for all the Pittsburghers on the call, I'm going to ask you a rhetorical question. You don't have to answer, just answer in your mind. Giving everything I just told you, where did Rabbi Rothschild go to high school? So most of you probably answered Alderdice. And if you know your Squirrel Hill geography, you know that Taylor Alderdice High School was directly across the street from where the Rothschilds lived. But he did not go there because Taylor Alderdice High School, which in many ways became a Jewish public high school, was not started until 1927. And that was the year that Rabbi Rothschild graduated from high school. So he went to the neighborhood elementary school, Colfax Elementary School, and then he went to Shenley High School. And you're looking at a picture of Shenley High School. Shenley High School was the first $1 million public school building built in America. And it holds a very special place in the hearts of Pittsburghers. Before Alderdice, Shenley was where Squirrel Hill families were sending their children. And even for a few years after Alderdice was built, students that had started at Shenley continued there because they didn't want to lose their friends. So he went here for high school, and even though Alderdice opened in his senior year, he continued to make the trek to another neighborhood rather than go to the high school across the street. So the reason that Shenley High School has such a fond place in the hearts of Pittsburghers is because through the magic of Pittsburgh geography, it happened to be a feeder school for 2 neighborhoods that were otherwise disconnected because of a gigantic kind of cliffside hill that would separate them. One is the Upper Hill District, which was the nicer part of the hill. And so it was where families who were kind of at the higher edge of working to middle class lived. It was also, the Upper Hill by the 20s was becoming increasingly a Black neighborhood. And then it also, on the other side, was a feeder school for Oakland, which was mostly a white neighborhood and had both a working class section and a very upscale section called Shenley Farms, which is right across from Shenley High School. So as a result of this, Shenley High School drew in a very diverse group of students, and it became known throughout the years as a model for racial integration in a public school that proved successful. And so when you go through, whereas Alderdice was a mostly white school for the first half of the 20th century, when you go through Rabbi Rothschild's yearbook, you find both Black students and white students, and you find working class and middle class students. I don't have the magic document that shows what this meant to him, but this is the milieu that he would have grown up in. There's not a whole lot that appears about Rabbi Rothschild from high school, but one of the themes that pops up again and again is his speaking abilities. So in April of 1927, he is selected to be on as part of the student play that year, which was a play called So This Is London. And it's funny because it says Shenley Play on Toleration. And I was really excited all of a sudden. What is that, toleration, what is that going to mean? And it turns out it's a play about an American boy who marries an English girl and all of the cross-cultural drama that ensues. As a result of the play, he wins an oration contest that allows him to be the speaker at the graduation program that year. So that's what you're looking at there. And then this is his page in the yearbook, and it just has this great little poem about him. He must be most formidable when he's met in debate, for even blasé seniors say that Jackie can orate. And so obviously for those of you who are from Atlanta and knew Rabbi Rothschild, you know that one of his skills in the rabbinate was his ability to, was oration, his ability to give a speech. And you can see that that really pops up even from his youth. So let's talk about Rodef Shalom, which is such a crucial part of his story in Pittsburgh. So Rodef Shalom is the oldest Jewish congregation in Pittsburgh. It dates back in some ways to the founding of the community in the 1840s, but it's founded in it's chartered in the 1850s. It starts in the downtown area, and then in 1906, it moves to the border between Oakland and Shadyside, very close to Shenley High School, just a few blocks away. And they build this beautiful synagogue that you're looking at here. Rabbi Rothschild had personal relationships with 3 of the rabbis there. So you're looking from left to right at Dr. J. Leonard Levy, Dr. Samuel Goldenson, and Dr. Solomon Freehoff. So these were the 3 rabbis that he would have dealt with there. Dr. Levy was the rabbi when he was a child in the congregation. And I don't know how much of a personal connection he had with him, but he would have seen this rabbi who was very dynamic, very charismatic, and really made Rodef an outward-facing congregation that not only was concerned with its own internal affairs, but was very much concerned with how can the Jewish community interact with the broader community of Pittsburgh, and how can it help, and how can it be a part of improving life in Pittsburgh. And so when you look through the Jewish newspapers from that time, you find all these wonderful hints of the kind of person that Rabbi Rothschild was as a child. And so this is an example of the collections that were taken up during the religious school. And you can see about halfway down here that Rabbi Rothschild, along with 3 other students, has collected his charity for the Armenian children. So this is 1919. This is in the middle of the Armenian genocide, which is taking place from about 1915 into the early 20s. And I guess he gets wind of this and decides that he's going to donate his charity money for that purpose. The rabbi who seemed to have made the greatest impact on him was Dr. Goldenson. Dr. Goldenson was a much calmer figure in congregational life than Dr. Levy, but he was no less concerned with improving the relationship between Rodef and the broader world, and also forcing the congregation to ask difficult questions of himself. If you look in the 2 biographies of Rabbi Rothschild, they both mention this sermon that Dr. Goldenson gave about the coal strikers in Pittsburgh. So I believe this is the sermon that they're talking about. This is an ad for it in the local newspaper, and it's called, "Am I My Brother's Keeper?" So you already get a sense of what this sermon is about. But thankfully, there's a book of his sermons, and so I was able to track this down. It's a wonderful sermon. It's a real barn burner of a sermon, and I just want to do 2 quick quotes from it. So what he's essentially talking about in this sermon is 2 things. There's a strike of coal miners going on outside of the city limits of Pittsburgh in Western Pennsylvania, and he wants to discuss the responsibility that families in Pittsburgh have to those families out in the coal patch. And he's also challenging those in the congregation who said that this is no business of a rabbi, that the rabbi should just be dealing with purely spiritual matters and should not be worried about what's going on in the broader world. So this is a quote where he is summing up his case for the rabbi being able to speak on such issues. He says that behind every economic or political issue are humans and their own successes and failings as humans, as godly created creatures. And he says, because of that, that the man who speaks for moral and human values, meaning clergy, is not only within his sphere when he gives his thought to questions such as the one before us this morning, but he is even under obligation to do so. And then he really gets into the heart of the matter. And he looks out at this congregation that has, in some cases, leading industrialists in the city, in some cases, people who have a direct financial connection to the coal strike situation. And he says that he is speaking to them, and he says, "I believe the hearts of these people are good, but for a time they have been living in the palace of the king." This is a reference to Queen Esther, who had been living in the palace of King Ahasuerus and was reluctant to stand up for the Jews. He says, "Out of sight of those who are suffering and in misery. I believe that if all of us could see the miners as I saw them," so he had actually gone out into the coal patch to visit these miners, "and could talk to that little Italian woman as I did, and hear her repeat over and over again, 'Oh, so hard, so hard,' we would be moved to find a way. What we need is the will. As the will is now beginning to stress itself in charity, so I believe it will soon go on to justice and go the limit by way of sacrifice. So what he was saying was that at that moment, people were willing to give money to help the coal miners, but that there was another step beyond that, which was making sure that there was justice in the world so that the situation of these coal miners would be improved. And then beyond that, there was this idea of sacrifice, that maybe it would even take a certain amount of hardship to make things right. So that's a very gutsy sermon to deliver. So Rabbi Rothschild graduates in 1927. He eventually goes to Hebrew Union College. And then he comes back in 1937 to take a job as an assistant at Rodef. At this point, the rabbi is Dr. Solomon B. Freehoff. There's this great article here that has a little telegram that he sent his mom, where he says, "I am Freehoff's assistant. My luck still holds. Much love, Jack." So Dr. Freehoff had a saying that he used to say, which was, there are rabbis who lead with their head and rabbis who lead with their feet. And Dr. Freehoff was someone who led with his head. He's known for these incredible sermons and lectures that he would give. He had a Wednesday morning book review series that regularly brought 1,000 people to the synagogue to hear these book reviews. He had a worldview, but that was not necessarily translated into being out in the streets. And so he often relied on his assistant rabbis to do a lot of the day-to-day work of the congregation and to do a lot of the footwork out in the community. So when you see Rabbi Rothschild's schedules, you see a ton of weddings, a ton of funerals, a ton of meetings. One of the things that he is credited with is, along with one of the congregants, is creating the junior congregation. And I think this is really important. One of the things you see in Rodef history is that the junior congregation often becomes a force for new ideas in the life of the congregation. When you have a big old congregation that has multi-generation families in it, you run the risk of things becoming stagnant if there's not a way for younger people to involve themselves in the life of the congregation. And so the junior congregation played a hugely important role in the congregation up until the 2000s when it was disbanded. And then this is something that I don't know how strongly it ties into the story we're telling today, but I feel like I have to mention it. So after Pearl Harbor, Rabbi Rothschild enlists. He comes back to Pittsburgh occasionally during those years, but he's not a rabbi here. But certainly he would have known about this event that happens in November of 1944. He was in town just a few weeks before. During the high holiday services that year, during the Yom Kippur services that year, somebody threw a brick through the stained glass window at Rodef Shalom. It did not get a lot of press coverage at the time, presumably because the Jewish community, I assume they didn't want the coverage. I don't know. I haven't really been able to figure out a lot about it. This is an example of a sermon that Rabbi Freehoff gave, but it's just a little bit of a foreshadowing of the sense of these sanctuaries being attacked from the outside and how disruptive and scary that can be for a congregation and for rabbis. So in 1946, Rabbi Rothschild takes the position at the temple in Atlanta. He also gets married that year. And Rabbi Freehoff comes to do the installation at the temple in September of 1946. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy, and we'll pick up where the story leaves off in Atlanta.
Thank you so much, Eric. I appreciate your insight on Rabbi Rothschild's early life. I'll go ahead and share my screen. If y'all joined us after the introductions, my name is Jeremy Katz, and I am the Senior Director of Archives at the William Bremen Jewish Heritage Museum here in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm going to pick up where Eric left off, talking about a little bit about his life in the Army in Atlanta as well, and his legacy. So as Eric mentioned, soon after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Rabbi Rothschild enlists in the Army chaplaincy. He does his basic training at Fort Bragg, is shipped out of San Francisco in September of 1942, and is soon backing up troops on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. You can see here, this is actually a Shabbat service on Guadalcanal, and this is the menorah that the troops made for him. And that you can see that the candle holders are actually made out of spent shell casings. So it just goes to show how much the troops supported him and thought so highly of him to create this menorah for him. And he was actually one of the first Jewish chaplains in the American Army to face combat. He was backing up the Marines that made some of the first offensive operations during World War II. And now in 1943, he's stationed in Fiji and contracts malaria and is sent back home to the States for treatment. And after he recovers, Eric mentioned that he made some rounds throughout the States. He was actually a public speaker for the military. He would meet with service members and parents and talk about the war effort. And this is when we start to see a little bit of a foreshadow in his life and his legacy. He was definitely impacted by the war. He saw the destruction of war, and he saw the determination of this greatest generation to come back and build a better world. And so kind of foreshadows to his eventual crusade in social justice. Now, if you are interested in Rabbi Rothschild's life in the service, I highly recommend you check out Southern Jewish History, the journal published by the Southern Jewish Historical Society. Just last year, they had an article featuring Rabbi Rothschild during his time in the service. And this journal is free with your membership to the Southern Jewish Historical Society. So it's a great way to support the society and a great perk of being a member. Now, as Eric mentioned, soon after being honorably discharged from the military in April of 1946, he accepts the pulpit the month following at the temple. And so what is the Jewish community like in 1946 in Atlanta? And we are very, very fortunate that we know exactly what the community was like, because in the archives, we have the Federation records. This population study was conducted by the Jewish Community Council, which today is the Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta. And actually the exact year that he came, we can look and see what the demographics were like in the Jewish community. And what you're seeing are two distinct populations in Atlanta. You have this grouping up here, this northern part. If you're not familiar with Atlanta, this is Piedmont Park. These are the newer neighborhoods at the time. You have Ansley, Morningside, Virginia Highlands, Ponce Highlands, and this is the Temple crowd. This is the German-speaking, German-descendant Jewish community, descendants of immigrants that came from Central Europe in the mid-1800s, either right before the Civil War or immediately following. And we're a generation ahead of this group down here. This group is the Eastern European Jewish community and Sephardic Jewish community that came to Atlanta at the turn of the 20th century. And so there's more than just a geographical divide between these two communities. There are also social, economic, and also religiosity. This is a very Reformed congregation. These are very Orthodox congregations. And so the best illustration of the divide in this community is The Last Night of Ballyhoo, which was written by the same playwright who wrote Driving Miss Daisy, the Academy Award-winning film. And Last Night of Ballyhoo talks about, and Ballyhoo was still going on in 1946, so Rabbi Rothschild definitely came into this community. Ballyhoo was this annual dance that was put together by the German-speaking Jews, German descent group of Jews, and meant to for like-minded Jews from around the region to meet and mingle and date. And the story is about a German-speaking, German Jewish girl wanting to take a Eastern European Jewish boy to Ballyhoo, and the family confronting their intra-ethnic biases. And so Rabbi Rothschild is coming into this very unique divided community. And one of his legacies is helping to unify this community. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. Now, in terms of just a general politics at the time, Georgia is a bubbling cauldron. You have populists and demagogues occupying the highest political offices in the state. Folks like Lester Maddox on the top left, he served as lieutenant governor and governor. The gentleman on the top right is Herman Talmadge. He served as governor and later senator, a U.S. senator representing the state of Georgia. Both these gentlemen were staunch segregationists, would rather close schools and businesses rather than integrate. And you also had the first neo-Nazi hate group in America, founded right here in Atlanta in 1946, the same year that Rothschild arrived. And at the bottom left, you'll see a picture of an undercover FBI agent who confiscated dynamite from the Colombians. Although this group was short-lived and only lasted about a year, one of the Colombians' members, a gentleman named George Bright, 10 years later would be accused of being the mastermind behind the temple bombing. So some ramifications from the Colombians even a decade later. But Atlanta has always been this island of progressives and a sea of conservatives. And Rabbi Rothschild had some allies in the city, particularly Mayor William Hartsfield, the gentleman on the far left, the longest serving mayor of Atlanta. And I really credit him as really making Atlanta what it is today. He coined the phrase, Atlanta is the city too busy to hate. And he really championed progressive causes, economics over racial intolerance. And so that's why the airport is named after him. He brought a lot of businesses to Atlanta. And I think that's why Atlanta thrived while other southern cities like Birmingham, for example, Birmingham was actually a little bit bigger than Atlanta around this time. And because we had progressive politicians like Mayor Hartsfield, I think we really thrived in ways that places like Birmingham, who focused more on their racial intolerance than business, lagged behind. Speaking of businesses, you had, of course, Coca-Cola, and President Robert Woodruff of the Coca-Cola Company was very progressive. He was a big supporter of the arts and education. Woodruff Library at Emory University is named after him. The Woodruff Art Center, which is where the High Museum, the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra take place. So a very important business leader in Atlanta. And then also in the press, you had progressive leaders like Ralph McGill at the bottom right. They said there were two kinds of people in Atlanta. Those who couldn't eat their breakfast until they read Ralph McGill, and those who couldn't eat their breakfast after reading Ralph McGill. So a very polarizing person, but a supporter, liberal-leaning supporter of the Supreme Court in the press in Atlanta. And we'll talk more about him in just a moment, as well as Mayor Hartsfield. But I think his closest ally was Janice, his soon-to-be wife, when he arrived in Atlanta. Eric mentioned that his rabbi came down for the wedding and his installation, and Janice has a very amazing family history and deep ties into the Atlanta Jewish community. Actually, her grandfather was one of the first rabbis at the temple, Rabbi Alphabet Brown. And I hope I'm not embarrassing her. I think she's on the call, but I want to show this clip from her oral history that we just shot in February, right before the health crisis hit. And she's talking about the first time that she met Rabbi Rothschild. I want you to pay attention to two things. I want you to pay attention to, first of all, just the twinkle in her eye that she still gets when she talks about meeting Rabbi Rothschild. And then I also want you to pay attention to what she says about Rabbi Marks. Rabbi Marks is the rabbi that Rabbi Rothschild was coming to succeed.
And I was on the sunboard facing the tennis court, and I noticed a foursome, and I kept watching, but I didn't know one of the guys. So I asked Nina Braille, who was sunning next to me, "Who's that?" And she says, "Oh, that's the new rabbi. You want to meet him?" And my response was, and I maybe shouldn't be saying this for posterity, but I will, because basically the story's already known anyway. But when she said, "That's the new rabbi," I said, "Oh, that's ridiculous. You know Marx will never retire." Well, apparently he and I were the only ones in Atlanta who didn't know that he had been retired. And he didn't find out for quite a while. That was a very difficult period for us. But at any rate, that's how I met him. He came off the court. We met, and he asked me if I wanted to have dinner with him that night. And actually, I wanted to, but I couldn't because I was in a radio play. They didn't have television yet. And the station, the WSB, was on top of the Biltmore, and he was living in the Biltmore. So I said, you know, if you want to, I can come down and have a cup of coffee with you after the show. And that's what I did.
And how long did you date before it got serious?
Well, 2 or 3.
Absolutely love that clip. And Janice, we'll talk more about her later. She was just such a, behind every great man is an even greater woman. That's certainly true for Janice. Such a treasure in the community. Now, she mentioned Rabbi Marks. So who was Rabbi David Marks? He was born and raised in New Orleans, attended Hebrew Union College, and became the first American-born, American-trained rabbi at the temple. He arrived in 1896, and he held the position of spiritual leader at the temple for the next 50 years until 1946 when Rabbi Rothschild arrived. So he endured 2 world wars and also the lynching of a temple member, Leo Frank. And so that certainly weighed on his worldview, especially since he was trained in the Pittsburgh platform, which was the classical reform ideology that the Jewish people are not a peoplehood. We're a community. We're a religious community. We're nothing more, nothing less. And so we don't need to obey by the dietary laws, by the laws governing how you dress. We don't need to support the state of Israel because we're not a peoplehood. And so he very much so transformed the temple into these ideologies and abolished talit and kippot from the sanctuary, removed Hebrew from services and from Sunday school. And I think the physical embodiment of Rabbi Rothschild of Rabbi Marks that still lives today is the temple itself. The building on Peachtree Street was built in 1931 under his leadership. He worked closely with Philip Schutze, who was a famed Atlanta architect, to design this building. And you'll see the image of the sanctuary. The stained glass windows are red, white, and blue. The seating is New England style pews. And it's hard to see, but the eternal light hangs from an American gold eagle. So he certainly thought of Jews being American before being Jewish. And so the temple mindset at the time was a lot different than today. It was still, folks still remember the lynching of Leo Frank. As I mentioned, he was a businessman, a member of the temple who was lynched by an angry mob, a very scary period of anti-Semitic outbursts in the city. And nobody wanted to rock the boat and potentially be ostracized by the community. So that was really the first the first hurdle that Rabbi Rothschild had to overcome, was winning over Rabbi Marks. And there's a funny anecdote about when he first arrived in Atlanta, and the eternal light went out, and he approached Rabbi Marks, and Rabbi Marks, he said, what do we do? The eternal light went out, and Rabbi Marks says, I don't know. It never went out when I was rabbi. So he had a really quick personality to him, but I think he did wind up winning over Rabbi Marks, because Rabbi Marks was pretty progressive in his own right. He worked a lot with interfaith relations, helped found the National Council of Jewish Women. So I think he secretly really liked Rabbi Rothschild. So Rabbi Rothschild arrives in this community, and as we mentioned, he was already kind of a social justice warrior. He had experienced the war, was starting to preach about building a better world. And he comes to Atlanta, and you can already see he's starting to make some reforms. He's wearing the rabbinic robes. If you look at Rabbi Marks on the page before, he's not wearing his rabbinic robes. He's wearing a suit and tie. He didn't like to be called rabbi. He liked to be called Reverend or Dr. Marks. So already making some of these fundamental changes. Ironic that Rabbi Rothschild was from Pittsburgh, but he was actually trained under the Columbus platform, which was the newer age version of Reform Judaism, traditional Reform Judaism, because the world had changed. We had the rise of Nazism, the need for a Jewish state, and we start to see the pendulum swinging back in the Reform movement towards the more traditional values of seeing Jews as a peoplehood, reintroducing Hebrew into services and Sunday schools. And we'll see a little bit later on, that's one of the legacies that he leaves behind. He actually reinstates the ritual bar mitzvah as well. And he also really, comes to Atlanta, sees the discrimination against the Black community, becomes very outspoken and starts to rock the boat. And a lot of people are a little weary of that because people remember the lynching of Leo Frank. They don't want to upset the boat. Rabbi Marks was very close to Leo Frank. He even actually accompanied his body back to Brooklyn to be interred. And so people are a little scared that he's making the temple a target. And they were right. On October 12th, 1958, in the early morning hours, 50 sticks of dynamite exploded on the north entrance to the temple. Luckily, it happened in the early morning and nobody was there and nobody was injured. But you can see on the right, it caused quite an extensive amount of damage to the building. It destroyed a classroom and part of the sanctuary. And you could see Rabbi Rothschild there inspecting the damage, and alongside him is Mayor Hartsfield, who I mentioned earlier. Mayor Hartsfield was on his way to church that morning, heard the news and diverted to the temple. And he did a live broadcast from the scene with the full view of the destruction in the background. We'll play that for you.
Atlanta has always been a lighthouse of racial and religious tolerance in the South. And we are shocked and amazed that this awful thing could happen in our midst. And we prefer to believe that it is the work of people outside of our city. We have brought every resource of law enforcement to bear. We have offered rewards, and we hope that the perpetrators of this thing will be apprehended. But my friends, here you see the end result of bigotry and intolerance. And whether they like it or not, those who practice rabble-rousing and demagoguery are the godfathers of the cross burners and the dynamite.
So he basically calls out these populist demagogue politicians and say, you are directly responsible for this destruction, and that this is not Atlanta. Atlanta is a lighthouse for justice and equality. And that was a huge deal to have a very popular mayor come out and support the temple at a time when it needed it the most. And so the public response is really what's important here. Even though nobody was charged of the crime, there were people that went on trial. George Bright faced trial twice. One was hung jury, the second was acquittal. Despite that, the outpouring of support for the temple is what really set it apart from the lynching of Leo Frank, where there was an outpouring of anti-Semitism. And I mentioned Ralph McGill, the editor, journalist for the Atlanta Constitution, publisher for the Constitution. And he wrote a column called A Church, a School, and actually won the Pulitzer Prize in 1959. And Rabbi Rothschild gave his most famous sermon the following Friday, And None Shall Make Them Afraid, where he talks about Atlanta will overcome this and come together because we're all part of this brotherhood. Now, I wish I could talk more about the temple bombing. It's really a presentation in and of itself. But here are some additional resources on the temple bombing. An article written by Janice Rothschild, who called it The Bomb That Healed, her own personal memoir of the bombing of the temple. And she talks about how this healed those wounds that were still left open from the lynching of Leo Frank. And of course, the temple bombing by Melissa Fay Green that came out in 1996. And really half of the book kind of reads like a biography of Rabbi Rothschild. So it's kind of a 2-for-1. You get to learn about Rabbi Rothschild's life, and you also get to learn all the details about the bombing and the subsequent trial. But I want to talk about a couple of other important pivotal moments in Rabbi Rothschild's career, including being the chair of the first integrated banquet in Atlanta. As a close friend of Coretta and Martin Luther King, Mayor Ivan Allen Jr. appointed Rabbi Rothschild to chair the committee to put together a banquet in honor of Martin Luther King winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And so you see here, this is at the banquet. On the left is Rabbi Rothschild with Martin Luther King, giving him this engraved Steuben glass bowl that was actually designed by Janice. And you can see a picture of them with their close friends in the top right. And at the bottom right is a letter from Martin Luther King to our benefactor at the Bremen Museum, and the gentleman we're named after, Bill Breman, he was a member of this committee, and Martin Luther King wrote to him saying, "Thank you so much for being a part of this, this dinner honoring me." Now, speaking of this committee that Rabbi Rothschild assembled, it's really a who's who of Jewish Atlanta. I'm just going to go through the list. Cecil Alexander was a prominent architect and a civil rights leader, a member of the temple. Rabbi Harry Epstein and Rabbi Emanuel Feldman, bringing together the Jewish clergy in the city to be a part of this committee, especially from different denominations. Harry Epstein is a conservative rabbi. Rabbi Emanuel Feldman was for the Orthodox community at Beth Jacob. The Haas family, one of the first Jewish families to settle in Atlanta. Abe Goldstein, owner of Pryor Tire, or the first private business in Atlanta to hire blacks in a sales position. Of course, Mayor Hartsfield. Let's see who else is Ben Massell and Sam Massell. Sam Massell became the first Jewish mayor in Atlanta in the 70s. Ben Massell, his uncle, Mayor Hartsfield called him a one-man boom, a bit of a real estate tycoon. Ralph McGill is a part of this committee as well. The Montag family, again, temple members. And Bill Breman was on here as well. Who else? Charles Wittenstein as well. Let's see, where is he? Yeah, Charles Wittenstein actually worked at ADL and helped get a partial posthumous pardon for Leo Frank in the 1980s. So bringing together these community leaders, particularly from the Jewish community, to help create this first integrated banquet in Atlanta. He was also a unifier in the community. As I mentioned earlier, he came into a Jewish community that was deeply divided. And you can see in the middle there, no inner barrier. This is the reporting of the Southern Israelite on a trip that was the symbolic trip that Rabbi Rothschild took with Harry Epstein, the spiritual leader of actually the largest congregation in Atlanta at the time, a synagogue. They traveled to Israel together, as well as co-chaired the Atlanta Welfare Fund Drive for that year in 1950. And then on the far right is a joint Thanksgiving service at AA Synagogue in 1954. And Rabbi Harry Epstein led the service, and Rabbi Jacob Rothschild gave the sermon. Some other rabbis here, Rabbi Marks is actually here as well as a Rabbi Emeritus. Rabbi Feldman is here representing the Orthodox community, as well as Rabbi Cohen, who is head of the Rodef Shalom, the Sephardic Jewish community in Atlanta. So hoping to homogenize this community, focusing more on shared values and instead of these perceived differences, and help make the community into this cohesive community that we see today. And then one other legacy of his is, as I mentioned, he was trained under the Columbus platform, helping to bring the Jewish community at the temple from this classical Reform Judaism to a more traditional Reform. And I think the earmark of that is reinstating the bar mitzvah ceremony in 1972. And here's a picture of the first bar mitzvah ceremony since 1899 at the temple. There's a picture on the left, and that's Glenn Nadel with Rabbi Rothschild overlooking his shoulder. And here is an oral history that we did with Glenn Nadel a couple of years ago, talking about this experience of being the first bar mitzvah at the temple in almost 100 years.
So we started talking to Rabbi Rothschild, who put up a lot of resistance and, said we don't do that here. It's, Reform congregation. Yeah, and it took probably at least a couple of years of talking and persuading before he finally agreed to do it. And there were certain ground rules in doing it. Which were? Number one, I would still be confirmed. Going back to what you said, they thought at the time that the confirmation was more important than the bar mitzvah. And he felt that that was the end of Jewish education, not the bar mitzvah. He was afraid that I would take the bar mitzvah as the end of Jewish education. So the first thing he said was, you're going to be confirmed. I said, and my parents said, that's fine. Second thing is, he was very aware of the fact that a lot of bar and bat mitzvahs at the time there were big parties that were already starting, even in that day, though they're much bigger now. And didn't want to have a big showy party afterwards. So my parents agreed that I wouldn't have a party afterwards. They had a small one for themselves at my Uncle Al's house with adults, but there were virtually no children there. So it was not a traditional bar mitzvah party. On December the 2nd, 1972, it was the date of the bar mitzvah. And I remember my dad had helped me pick out a suit because I didn't own a suit before then, because I had no reason to wear one. And when we got there, the congregation was completely packed. The entire lower and the balcony was totally packed. Now, they did not do televised services in Friendship Hall or anything else at that point. And it wasn't broadcast to the chapel, but the entire congregation was completely filled. And there was a sense amongst the congregation that it was historic. So many people decided to come.
I just love that Rabbi Rothschild thought there was too much bar instead of mitzvah during the ceremony. And so he curtailed the party a little bit. But even though Rabbi Rothschild passed away the following year, he left this lasting legacy that I think is threefold. First of all, social justice that has been carried on by Rabbi Alvin Sugarman and Rabbi Peter Berg, as well as the Rothschild Social Justice Institute that was established at the temple, thanks in part to Blank Family Foundation. Also unifying the community, bringing it together, as well as shifting the community to a more a traditional form of Reform Judaism. Now, before we get to Q&A, I just want to quickly give you an overview of the archives at the Bremen Museum. Many of the items that you just saw during my part of the presentation came from our archives. We are the largest repository for Jewish history in the Southeast. And what you're seeing, a lot of numbers that are on the screen. What I want you to take away from this is that we have a very diverse collection in terms of format and content. We collect everything from artifacts, three-dimensional materials to two-dimensional materials, and also AV materials like the oral histories that I showed you today. And we also do programming as well. We have a diverse range of programs, including this program that we organized today was through our archives department. So we are very busy trying to make these archival collections that span across the religious spectrum, across the business spectrum, across the Jewish organizations in the Southeast. We collect rabbis' papers, organization records, you name it. So we are your repository for Jewish history in the Southeast, but we have very humble beginnings. We started as a small archives in the closet of the old Federation building on Peachtree Street. Here's my predecessor, Sandy Breman, who was the founding archivist, grew the archives over a period of 30 years into this amazing repository. So I am standing on the shoulders of giants. We collect not just in major cities in the area, but also small towns throughout Georgia. Also, we have a large collection from Savannah, the Savannah Jewish Archives. While we're talking about the temple, I want to point out a couple of projects. This project, we partnered with the temple to create an exhibition about their history for their sesquicentennial that is on display in their lobby. We have original artifacts, touchscreen displays with videos, text panels that chronicle the history of this storied congregation. We're also working on a book about the history of the congregation that'll come out sometime before the end of the year, I believe. So if you're ever in town, please go visit the lobby at the temple. It's a very historic building, obviously. And then one other thing I really want to show you before we open up Q&A is our Google Arts and Culture page, which we just did a soft launch of. And so here's the Atlanta entity page. You can see the High Museum, the King Center, GPB, Scatafash, Atlanta History Center, and here's the Bremen Museum's landing page for Google Arts and Culture. We have an online exhibition chronicling the Jewish history of Atlanta. We have 100 items from our collection. And what's great about the Google Arts and Culture platform is that it's a high resolution imaging software program. So we can actually zoom in. This is the bottle cap from the first batch of kosher Coca-Cola, koshered by a local rabbi here, Rabbi Tobias Geffen. And you can even zoom in so far that you can see the inscription, his inscriptions certifying that Coca-Cola is kosher. And we have big plans for our full launch, which will take place during the Atlanta rollout. We'll be rolling out with a number of different cultural institutions in Atlanta. We have about 6 other online exhibitions we're going to launch, including one about the temple bombing. But the one that I'm really excited about is a virtual tour of the Bremen Museum, especially right now since our doors are closed. This will allow visitors to utilize Google Street View technology to actually navigate our gallery.
All right, so while Jeremy's dealing with the technical stuff there, I'm gonna answer some of the questions that have come up, at least on the Pittsburgh side. There was a question here, an eagle-eyed person noticed that the sermon that Dr. Goldenson gave was on a Sunday and was asking what the deal was with that. So one of the things that's interesting about Rodef Shalom is that for many years they had a Sunday service. And my understanding is that this went back to the time period when a lot of Jews were merchants and found it difficult to get off on Saturdays. And so rather than lose that crowd, they created a new service on Sunday. And one of the hallmarks of it was a lecture. So it was actually considered a lecture, not a sermon. It was often around 45 minutes long. And it usually dealt with some large intellectual idea. And one of the things that's fascinating about that, Jeremy, I'm just going to answer a question real quick and then I'll throw it back to you. One of the things that's fascinating about that is that it brought in both Jews and non-Jews. So that crowd that he's talking to is a crowd of Jewish and Christian laity. And that meant that the sermon that he's giving is not just a rabbi speaking to his own people, but it's actually like a public statement. All right, Jeremy, back to you.
Yeah, sorry about that, everybody. It looks like I lost internet connection. That's why I was having some issues. But I want to just quickly finish up by showing you all what I was talking about with this Google Arts and Culture, where we can actually take a virtual tour of the museum. And here, for example, is in our gallery, we have a piece of the rubble from the temple bombing, and people will actually be able to zoom in and see the text panel regarding it and see and get a closer up view and give people a glance at what the Bremen Museum is all about, especially right now since our doors are closed. So thank you so much for your attention, and thank you, Eric, for filling in while I got booted. I'm happy to answer questions. Eric and I are happy to answer any questions that y'all might have.
So looking here, Adrian was asking why Rabbi Rothschild went to Shenley and not Taylor Alderdice. So Alderdice was not founded until 1927, and that was the year that Rabbi Rothschild graduated. A lot of the Squirrel Hill families that had sent their kids to Shenley for 9th, 10th, and 11th continued there through 12th grade rather than dislocate their kids and have them lose all their friendships in the final years of high school. Another Pittsburgh question I saw in here was whether he had any descendants in Pittsburgh, and I don't know. I know that his sister remained here for a while, but after she married, I don't know if she stayed in the city or left. I don't know of any Rothschilds in Pittsburgh.
Eric, when I got booted, I lost the history of the chat. So if you see anything Atlanta related, let me know and I'll be happy to answer it.
So one of the questions was whether Rabbi Rothschild had marched with Dr. King.
That's a very good question. I believe so. I don't know any specific examples. I know certainly other rabbis marched with Rabbi Rothschild, or sorry, with the King. Particularly Rabbi Heschel marched with that historic march from Selma to Montgomery over the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But he was very close with Martin Luther King. So I imagine so that he did march with him and protest with him at some point. So I don't have a more specific answer.
And then there's a question here for you, Jeremy, about how would you characterize the Atlanta Jewish community today?
That's a very good question. I would say it's much more cohesive than when Rabbi Rothschild arrived. Some of those barriers were knocked down by the Holocaust, by the birth of the state of Israel. And so it's a thriving Jewish community, especially these booms that Atlanta experienced following civil rights, following the Olympics. It's when Rabbi Rothschild arrived, there were 10,000 Jews in Atlanta. That's from that population study I showed you. And now there are 100,000 Jews in Atlanta, one of the largest in the country. And it really has seen a proliferation of Jewish organizations that cater to every aspect of Jewish life. I can just tell you from being a young Jewish professional here that there are a whole lot of offerings for across the generations. And so it's a great community to be a part of.
Jeremy, if you unmute Janice, she was trying to answer the question about Martin Luther King.
Oh, yeah. Hold on a second. Janice will certainly know more about that. Let me unmute her. Janice, can you hear us? Yeah, she might not have a microphone on her computer. I'm trying to unmute her and it's not working.
Okay.
Oh, there she is.
I wanted to answer the question about did he march. He didn't, but he very much wanted to. And the reason he didn't was that he knew that the first time he got any publicity for doing that, he would lose his, perhaps he wouldn't have lost his job, which was also a question among Southern rabbis, but he certainly would have lost his credibility in the public. He wouldn't have been invited to speak in various non-Jewish venues or write op-eds for the paper. So he could have satisfied himself by going on a march, but he couldn't. But by doing so, he would have cut off his ability to be of any more real help to the community. Okay.
Thank you so much, Denise, for that detailed response, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I didn't embarrass you too much with your oral history.
There's a question here about why Rabbi Rothschild didn't go back to Pittsburgh after World War II. I'd need to go back through year by year and see how all that played out with his various commitments. My understanding is that he doesn't get discharged from the Army until 46, so there's not really an opportunity. But Dr. Freehoff, I believe, came to Pittsburgh in 34, somewhere around there. And so he was early in his rabbinate. And if Rabbi Rothschild had remained in Pittsburgh, he would have essentially been consigning himself to an assistant position for a long period of time. Yeah.
It wasn't just that. This happened with a number of the rabbis who came back in the congregations. They agreed, in most congregations anyway, that they would save the job for the rabbi who went into the Army or Navy. But it wasn't really fair, he felt, when he went back to Pittsburgh. If he had gone back to Pittsburgh, he was a bachelor, and he would have taken the job away from a man who had been there a few years and who had a family. So besides the fact that it really was time for him to move on, he loved Pittsburgh, and he probably would have gone back had they not had anybody. But instead of interfering, he came to Atlanta, and I'm glad he did.
There's a question here: in what ways were Atlanta Jews complicit in Jim Crow?
Yeah, I'm happy to help answer that one. I wouldn't say complicit in Jim Crow. There were certainly business leaders in the Jewish community that were afraid of ostracizing their white clientele, and so they weren't progressive in a sense where they were integrating their businesses before others had integrated. And actually they got called out for that. The civil rights movement, peaceful protests took place at Jewish businesses, including Rich's department store, which was Jewish owned and had grown into the largest department store in the region, had a couple of segregated eateries in their downtown flagship store. And they thought if Rich's integrated, so too would the rest of the businesses, because it was the big dog in town, and Dick Rich refused to integrate. Right? Actually, Martin Luther King got arrested at Rich's in October of 1960. And some people tie that to JFK getting elected the following month because he helped get Martin Luther King out of prison when Richard Nixon didn't do anything, and helped kind of transition the vote from orthodox or from conservative to liberal, from the Republican to Democrat, I should say, of the black vote, which typically voted for Lincoln's party. And also Leb's Deli is also a good instance of a Jewish businessman who refused to integrate and really kind of lost his business because of all the bad publicity. So there are a couple of instances, but I would say the majority of Jews in Atlanta were supportive of civil rights. A lot of them were descendants of immigrants who had fled persecution in Europe and were sympathetic to the cause. But again, because of Leo Frank, of a member of the community being lynched in the 19-teens, a lot of people were kind of reluctant to stick their necks out, and social lines are drawn by color of skin rather than religion. So they were kind of enjoying a first-class citizenship, maybe the first time in their lives. And so they didn't really want to rock the boat and upset the status quo to ostracize themselves or the Jewish community. And that's why I speak to the courage of Rabbi Rothschild, of being so outspoken, being willing to rock the boat in a community like that of the South. All right, I want to be mindful of everybody's time. We ran a few minutes over. If nobody has a final question, we'll go ahead and call it a day. But I hope that you all enjoyed. And
Jeremy?
Yes.
I had just put a question in the chat about Janice's article, The Bomb That Healed. And I was wondering if she might be able to make a comment about any reflections that she had or what that was about. Thanks.
Are you asking why I called it The Bomb That Healed?
Yeah, and what was could you just tell us a little bit about that article, why you wrote it, and what story you wanted to tell with it?
Well, I forget why I wrote it, because I'm a writer and I write anytime I think I've got somebody to read it. But the reason I called it The Bomb That Healed is that I felt that it was like lancing a boil that had grown over, but it was still sore, and it would stay sore until you got the pus out. And that was the Leo Frank case, because I mean, I was born here, so I grew up really not ever hearing about Leo Frank until I went to college. And when I went home one weekend after learning about it and asked my mother if she knew anything about it, and her answer was, and by the way, Alfred Urey got exactly the same answer from his mother at about the same time of his life. And the answer was, why, of course, darling, you know Miss Lucille. Yes, we knew Lucille Frank. It never occurred to either one of us growing up why a middle-aged widow in those days. I mean, there were a lot of women whose husbands had died when they were in their middle age. So nobody talked about it. It was as if you just keep quiet, it'll go away, it won't happen. Well, that was the boil that was grown over and would have continued to fester until it was lanced. So I felt that's really what happened, thanks first of all to Mayor Hartsfield and also to President Eisenhower. We were staunch Democrats who couldn't understand why the president had not sent in the FBI to other desecrations of public buildings and so forth that had occurred during that period in the South. But when the president was told about the bombing, he responded off the cuff. He was speaking to a largely Jewish group 2 weeks before an interim election, when, by the way, the Republicans were behind at that time. Right off the cuff, hearing about it, he gave a response from his heart, not from his politics, and said, in effect, we can't have something like that in America. I'm going to send in the FBI. Well, that was the beginning of the end of all the problems in the South. You might not have seen all of it end right from that moment. But believe me, that was the beginning of the end, because for the first time, people would be, perpetrators would be apprehended. This wasn't done before, let alone convicted. And let alone even if it was noted at all in a newspaper that something had happened, it would be like at most 2 inches in the back of the paper. So President Eisenhower had a lot to do with ending things when he heard about the bombing, as well as what the mayor did in Atlanta and for the South by what he said.
I think that's an amazing way to wrap this up. Thank you so much, Janice, for your very detailed and amazing help explaining the legacy of Rabbi Rothschild, and no better person to do that. I want to thank our partners, Eric at the Rauh Jewish Archives, the Southern Jewish Historical Society, the Savannah Jewish Educational Alliance, Savannah Jewish Federation, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks. Be on the lookout for my email in just a few minutes. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope you enjoyed.
Thanks, everyone.